December 25, 1991. Moscow. The red hammer and sickle flag is lowered from atop the Kremlin for the last time. In its place rises the white, blue, and red tricolor of Russia. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last Soviet leader, has just resigned in a televised address, declaring the Soviet Union dissolved. The superpower that had dominated half the globe challenged American hegemony, put the first human in space, and represented an alternative to capitalism for 74 years simply ceases to exist. Not through war or invasion, but through internal collapse. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union is gone. And nobody, including the CIA and KGB, saw it coming. This is the story of how the seemingly eternal Soviet Empire fell apart, not with nuclear holocaust or tanks in Red Square, but through economic decay, nationalist awakening, political miscalculation, and the unintended consequences of reform. It's the story of how one man's attempt to save the system destroyed it, how captive nations won their freedom, and how the world changed forever in just 6 years. To understand the Soviet Union's collapse, we must understand what it was. The USSR was born from the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, built through Stalin's brutal industrialization and purges, victorious in World War II at the cost of 27 million lives, and evolved into a nuclear superpower competing with America. By the 1980s, it controlled 15 republics spanning 11 time zones with 290 million people. Its satellites stretched from Berlin to Vladivostok. Communist parties worldwide looked to Moscow. The Soviet military was the world's largest. Its nuclear arsenal could destroy civilization multiple times over. The system rested on several pillars: the Communist Party's monopoly on power, a centrally planned economy, military strength, security apparatus repression, and Marxist-Leninist ideology. These pillars seemed solid. Dissidents were few and suppressed. Most citizens accepted the system, even if they grumbled about shortages and queues. The West prepared for perpetual Cold War competition, not Soviet collapse. But beneath the surface, the system was rotting. The command economy, efficient at producing tanks and steel, couldn't provide consumer goods or innovate. Store shelves were often empty. People waited years for apartments or cars. The joke went, "They pretend to pay us, we pretend to work." Productivity stagnated. Technology lagged decades behind the West. The only sectors working well were military and space. Everything else was failing. The Soviet leadership was gerontocratic and ossified. Leonid Brezhnev ruled from 1964 to 1982, becoming increasingly senile. His era of stagnation saw economic growth slow to zero. Corruption was endemic. Ideology became hollow ritual nobody believed. The younger generation, educated and aware through samizdat literature and foreign radio broadcasts, knew the system wasn't working. Afghanistan was bleeding the USSR. The 1979 invasion to prop up a communist government turned into a brutal guerrilla war. Soviet conscripts died fighting Mujahideen funded and armed by America. By the mid-1980s, over 100,000 Soviet troops were bogged down in Afghanistan, suffering thousands of casualties annually. The war was unpopular, expensive, and unwinnable, the Soviet Vietnam. The economy was in crisis. Oil prices, high in the 1970s, collapsed in the mid-1980s. The USSR depended on oil exports for hard currency. Falling prices devastated revenues. The arms race with Reagan's America strained budgets further. Feeding, the military-industrial complex left nothing for consumer goods or infrastructure investment. The technological gap with the West was widening into an unbridgeable chasm. When Brezhnev died in 1982, he was replaced by Yuri Andropov, former KGB chief, who recognized the system's problems and began tentative reforms. But Andropov died after just 15 months. His successor, Konstantin Chernenko, was already dying when appointed. He lasted 13 months. The Soviet Union was literally dying at the top. Then came Mikhail Gorbachev. In March 1985, at age 54, he became General Secretary, young by Soviet leadership standards. Born in 1931 to a peasant family, Gorbachev had risen through party ranks in Stavropol, then joined the Politburo in 1980. He was intelligent, personable, and married to Raisa, an educated woman who influenced him. Unlike his predecessors, Gorbachev knew the system was unsustainable and believed reform was necessary. Gorbachev introduced two concepts that would destroy the Soviet Union: glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost meant openness, relaxing censorship, allowing public discussion of problems, admitting past mistakes. Perestroika meant restructuring, reforming the economy to make it more efficient, reducing central planning, allowing limited market mechanisms. Gorbachev believed the Soviet system was fundamentally sound but needed modernization. He thought transparency would expose and eliminate corruption and incompetence. He thought economic reforms would revitalize the command economy. He was spectacularly wrong. Glasnost and perestroika didn't reform the system, they unraveled it. Glasnost opened Pandora's box. Once people could speak freely, they revealed problems far worse than Gorbachev imagined. Newspapers exposed corruption, incompetence, and past crimes. Censorship relaxed. Previously banned books appeared. Television showed Western life, revealing how far behind the USSR had fallen. Nationalist grievances in republics, suppressed for decades, erupted. The more truth was revealed, the more obvious it became that the system was irredeemable. The Chernobyl disaster in April 1986 was an early crisis. A nuclear reactor in Ukraine exploded, releasing massive radiation. The initial Soviet response was typical: denial, cover-up, silence. But glasnost made the old approach impossible. Information leaked out. International pressure mounted. Gorbachev eventually admitted the disaster publicly. Chernobyl became a symbol of Soviet incompetence and dishonesty. It delegitimized the system in ways no dissident ever could. Perestroika failed economically. Gorbachev tried half measures, allowing small private businesses, permitting some market pricing, encouraging workplace democracy. These reforms disrupted the command economy without creating a functioning market. Production fell, shortages worsened, inflation soared, the economic crisis deepened. By the late 1980s, basic goods were scarce. People waited hours in queues for bread. The joke became reality. Everything Marx said about communism was false, but everything he said about capitalism was true. Gorbachev's foreign policy was revolutionary. He announced new thinking, ending the Cold War, withdrawing from Afghanistan, reducing military confrontation. In 1987, he signed the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with Reagan, eliminating an entire class of missiles. He withdrew Soviet troops from Afghanistan in 1989, admitting the war was a mistake. Most dramatically, he told Eastern European communist regimes they were on their own, no more Soviet tanks to save them. This was the Sinatra Doctrine, jokingly named after the song My Way. Eastern European countries could do it their way. The implications were staggering. Soviet domination of Eastern Europe had rested on the implicit threat of military intervention, as in Hungary, 1956, and Czechoslovakia, 1968. Without that threat, communist regimes had no legitimacy or popular support. Poland led the way. The Solidarity trade union, led by Lech Walesa, had challenged communist rule since 1980. The regime imposed martial law in 1981, arresting Solidarity leaders. But by 1989, the regime was desperate. It negotiated with Solidarity, agreeing to partially free elections in June 1989. Solidarity won overwhelmingly. By August, Poland had a non-communist prime minister. The first domino had fallen. Hungary opened its border with Austria in May 1989. East Germans vacationing in Hungary could now escape to the west. Thousands did. East Germany's regime, led by hardliner Erich Honecker, tried to stop the exodus but couldn't. Protests erupted in Leipzig and other cities. On October 18, Honecker was forced out. Then came November 9, 1989. The Berlin Wall, symbol of the Cold War division, opened. Thousands of East Germans crossed to West Berlin. People danced on the wall, chipping off pieces with hammers and pickaxes. Within days, the wall was effectively demolished. By October 1990, Germany reunified. The Iron Curtain had fallen. The revolutions of 1989 were remarkably peaceful. The Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, led by playwright Václav Havel, overthrew communism without bloodshed. Bulgaria's regime fell. Romania was the exception. Dictator Nicolae Ceausescu was overthrown and executed after violent protests in December 1989. Gorbachev watched as the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe evaporated. He did nothing. Some advisors urged intervention, but Gorbachev refused. Using force would destroy everything he was trying to achieve. But letting Eastern Europe go emboldened independence movements within the Soviet Union itself. The USSR was a prison of nations. 15 republics contained dozens of ethnic groups, many with historic grievances. Russians comprised barely half the population. Ukrainians, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Belarusians, and others had distinct identities, languages, and nationalist movements suppressed but not destroyed. Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, had been independent between the wars before Stalin annexed them in 1940. They never accepted Soviet rule. Glasnost let them express this. In August 1989, 2 million people formed a human chain across all 3 Baltic states, the Baltic Way, demanding independence. It was a powerful symbol. In early 1990, Lithuania declared independence. Gorbachev refused to recognize it and imposed an economic blockade. But he wouldn't use massive force. The cat-and-mouse game continued, republics declaring independence or sovereignty, Moscow refusing recognition but also not crushing them violently. Nationalism spread. Azerbaijan and Armenia went to war over Nagorno-Karabakh. Georgia sought independence. Moldova, Ukraine, Belarus, all began asserting sovereignty. The Union was unraveling. Meanwhile, Boris Yeltsin emerged as Gorbachev's rival. A Russian Communist Party official, Yeltsin had been promoted by Gorbachev but then clashed with him over reform pace. Yeltsin wanted faster, more radical change. In 1987, Gorbachev dismissed him from the Politburo, but this freed Yeltsin to become an opposition figure. Yeltsin positioned himself as a man of the people against the privileged party elite. He rode Moscow subways, visited factories, and criticized corruption. In March 1989, he was elected to the new Congress of People's Deputies with 89% of the vote, a rebuke to Gorbachev. In May 1990, he became chairman of the Russian Supreme Soviet, effectively president of the Russian Republic, the USSR's largest and most important component. Yeltsin then made a brilliant move. In June 1990, he declared Russian sovereignty, that Russian laws took precedence over Soviet laws. If Russia itself was pulling away from the USSR, the Union was finished. Yeltsin and Gorbachev became locked in a power struggle. Gorbachev was president of a Soviet Union that was disappearing. Yeltsin was leader of Russia, which was emerging as the successor state. The Soviet economy was collapsing. By 1990, GDP was shrinking. Inflation raged. The ruble was worthless. Store shelves were empty. Some regions issued ration cards. Industrial production plummeted. The Soviet government was losing control of its own economy as republics stopped sending taxes to Moscow and kept resources for themselves. Gorbachev faced impossible choices. Hardliners wanted crackdowns to restore order. Reformers wanted faster liberalization. He tried to balance both and satisfied neither. His approval rating plummeted. People blamed him for shortages, chaos, and national humiliation. In January 1991, Soviet forces cracked down in Lithuania and Latvia, killing protesters. Gorbachev claimed he hadn't ordered it, but nobody believed him. The violence backfired. strengthening independence movements and weakening Gorbachev domestically. Gorbachev proposed a new Union Treaty, a looser federation giving republics more autonomy while preserving the USSR in some form. 9 republics agreed to negotiate. The Baltic states, Georgia, Armenia, and Moldova refused. The treaty was scheduled to be signed on August 20, 1991. Hardliners decided to act first. On August 19, 1991, as Gorbachev vacationed in Crimea, a group calling itself the State Committee on the State of Emergency announced it was taking power. Gorbachev was placed under house arrest. Tanks rolled into Moscow. The coup plotters, including the KGB chief, defense minister, and prime minister, declared a state of emergency, banned political activity, and promised to restore order. The August coup seemed to succeed initially. Gorbachev was isolated. The military was involved, but the plotters were incompetent. They didn't arrest opposition leaders like Yeltsin. They didn't control communications. They didn't shut down independent media. And critically, they didn't have clear support from military or KGB rank and file. Boris Yeltsin rushed to the Russian parliament building, the White House, and climbed atop a tank, dramatically declaring resistance to the coup. His image standing on that tank, reading a statement condemning the coup, became iconic. Thousands of Muscovites surrounded the White House to defend it. The coup plotters ordered an assault, but commanders refused. Units defected to Yeltsin. After 3 days, the coup collapsed. The plotters were arrested. Gorbachev returned to Moscow on August 22. He thought he'd resume leadership. But everything had changed. Yeltsin was the hero who faced down the tanks. Gorbachev was associated with the system that had attempted the coup. The balance of power had shifted decisively. Yeltsin systematically dismantled Soviet structures. He banned the Communist Party in Russia. He took control of Soviet assets on Russian territory, buildings, resources, even the nuclear weapons. Republic after republic declared independence. The Soviet Union existed in name only. Ukraine's independence referendum on December 1, 1991 was the final blow. Ukraine, the USSR's second-largest republic, voted 90% for independence. Without Ukraine, there was no Soviet Union worth preserving. Russia alone couldn't sustain the empire. On December 8, 1991, Yeltsin and the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus met secretly at a hunting lodge in Belarus. They signed the Belavia Accords, declaring the Soviet Union dissolved and establishing the Commonwealth of Independent States, a loose association with no real power. They didn't consult Gorbachev, who was still officially Soviet president. Gorbachev was furious but powerless. Most republics quickly joined the CIS. Gorbachev had nothing left to lead. On December 25, 1991, in a televised address, he resigned as Soviet president. That evening, the Soviet flag was lowered. The Russian flag rose. The Soviet Union was history. The collapse's speed was stunning. In 1985, the USSR seemed eternal. By 1991, it was gone. The reasons were multiple and interconnected. Economically, the system was bankrupt. Central planning couldn't compete with market economies. The arms race drained resources. Technological stagnation left the USSR decades behind. By the 1980s, the gap was unbridgeable. The economy was dying slowly, and reforms accelerated its death. Politically, glasnost destroyed legitimacy. Once people could speak freely and see the truth, they rejected the system. The Communist Party's moral authority, built on revolutionary myth and claimed economic success, evaporated when confronted with reality: corruption, incompetence, lies, failure. Ideologically, nobody believed in Marxism-Leninism anymore. It was hollow ritual. Even party members were cynics going through motions for career advancement. Without ideological commitment, the system depended purely on coercion and material benefits. When coercion relaxed and material conditions worsened, nothing held it together. Nationally, the Soviet Union was an empire held by force. Russians were barely half the population. Other nationalities wanted independence. Once it became clear Moscow wouldn't use massive violence to prevent secession, the Union's days were numbered. Internationally, ending the Cold War removed external threat that had unified the country. Without capitalist encirclement, why did Soviet citizens need a militarized command economy? The West's success became obvious once the Iron Curtain lifted. Gorbachev's role was paradoxical. He triggered collapse trying to prevent it. His reforms exposed problems without solving them. He released forces he couldn't control. He was genuinely trying to save Soviet socialism by reforming it, but reform proved incompatible with the system's nature. You couldn't partially relax totalitarianism or partially introduce markets. The system was all or nothing, and once the pressure was released, it exploded. Some argue Gorbachev could have used force to preserve the Union. Maybe. But it would have required Tiananmen-scale massacres, not just in one square but across multiple republics. It would have required abandoning everything Gorbachev believed about reform and openness. It would have made the USSR an international pariah. And it might still have failed. You can't occupy your own country forever. Others blame Yeltsin for destroying the Union out of personal ambition. There's truth to this. Yeltsin's Russian sovereignty declaration was a power grab, but Yeltsin rode nationalist sentiment he didn't create. Russians themselves were tired of subsidizing other republics and being blamed for Soviet imperialism. Many Russians supported independence. The August coup was a final desperate attempt by the old guard to save the system. Its failure sealed the USSR's fate. The coup showed that hardliners were incompetent and lacked support even within the military and KGB. After it failed, the Communist Party was finished. Nobody would defend it. The Soviet Union lingered 4 more months but was already dead. The collapse had massive global consequences. The Cold War ended. The United States became the sole superpower, a unipolar moment. Nuclear war threat receded. Eastern Europe joined Western institutions, NATO and the EU. Germany reunified. Captive nations gained freedom. Communist ideology was discredited globally. But the collapse also created problems. 15 new countries emerged, many with unclear borders, ethnic tensions, and no experience with democracy or markets. Wars erupted in Nagorno-Karabakh, Chechnya, Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia. Millions of Russians suddenly lived as minorities in foreign countries. The Soviet military's nuclear weapons were scattered across 4 republics. Economic collapse in Russia led to the chaotic 1990s. Privatization became theft, living standards plummeted, life expectancy dropped, organized crime flourished. Russia's national humiliation shaped its future. Yeltsin's drunken incompetence and economic disaster discredited democracy in many Russians' eyes. Vladimir Putin, coming to power in 2000, promised to restore Russia's strength and greatness. His increasingly authoritarian rule and aggressive foreign policy, especially in Ukraine, stem partly from the trauma of Soviet collapse, which Putin called the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. The other former Soviet republics had mixed experiences. The Baltic states joined the EU and NATO, becoming stable democracies. Ukraine struggled with corruption and Russian interference before its recent democratic consolidation. Belarus remained essentially Soviet under Lukashenko's dictatorship. Central Asian republics became authoritarian kleptocracies. The Caucasus suffered wars and instability. For individuals, the collapse was traumatic. Overnight, Soviet citizens became citizens of new countries. Life savings were wiped out by inflation. Careers ended as state enterprises closed. The social safety net, guaranteed employment, housing, healthcare, education disappeared. Crime exploded. For many, especially older people, the collapse meant poverty and insecurity after lives of modest but stable existence. The 1990s were a decade of survival, not prosperity. Younger people and the educated often prospered in the new system. Those who could navigate market economics, who spoke foreign languages, who had entrepreneurial skills, they succeeded. The new Russia was more free but also more unequal. You could speak your mind, travel abroad, start businesses, but you might also be unemployed, unable to afford medicine, or victimized by criminals. Western triumphalism after Soviet collapse now seems naive. Francis Fukuyama proclaimed the end of history. Liberal democracy had won, alternatives were finished. The 1990s would see universal spread of democracy and markets. This didn't happen. Russia backslid into authoritarianism. China proved authoritarian capitalism was viable. Democracy's global advance stalled. Some historians argue the West mishandled the post-Soviet transition. America didn't provide a Marshall Plan-scale aid package. Western economic advice, shock therapy, rapid privatization, enriched oligarchs while impoverishing ordinary people. NATO expansion eastward, while understandable from Eastern European perspective, fed Russian resentment. Perhaps better Western policies could have helped Russia become a stable democracy and partner. Or perhaps Russia's authoritarian traditions and traumatized national psychology made that impossible. The Soviet collapse's lessons are contested. It showed that empires end, that economic failure erodes political systems, that once repression relaxes, people demand freedom, that nationalism is powerful, that reform can trigger revolution, that individual leaders matter. But it also showed that collapse doesn't guarantee democracy or prosperity, that freedom alone doesn't solve problems, that national humiliation breeds revanchism. Gorbachev's legacy is complex. In the West, he's a hero who ended the Cold War and freed Eastern Europe. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990. But in Russia, he's often reviled. The man who destroyed the Soviet Union, who presided over national humiliation, whose reforms caused economic catastrophe. Gorbachev himself has lived long enough to see his reforms reversed, his vision failed, and Russia become something he never wanted. The Soviet Union's collapse was one of history's pivotal moments, comparable to the fall of Rome or Napoleon's defeat. It ended an ideological conflict defining the 20th century. It redrew the political map. It changed how hundreds of millions of people lived. It opened possibilities, good and bad, that shaped the past 3 decades and continue shaping our world. From Gorbachev's tentative reforms to Yeltsin on the tank to the flag coming down, the collapse was both inevitable and surprising. Inevitable because the system was unsustainable economically, politically, and ideologically. Surprising because no one predicted when or how it would happen. Systems that seem permanent can collapse with stunning speed once their foundations crumble. The Soviet Union's epitaph might be Gorbachev's words on December 25, 1991. "We're living in a new world." That new world was more free but also more uncertain. The Soviet collapse ended one era and began another. Whether that new era is better depends on where you stand, in Estonia or Tajikistan, as a Russian billionaire or pensioner, as a Ukrainian resisting Russian invasion, or a nostalgic communist mourning the Soviet dream. The hammer and sickle flag came down. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union dissolved. But its ghost haunts us still, in Russian revanchism, in post-Soviet frozen conflicts, in the authoritarian nostalgia poisoning Russian democracy, in the oligarchic capitalism that replaced Soviet socialism. The Soviet Union fell, but we're still living in the world its collapse created, still dealing with consequences we don't fully understand, still asking whether the end was tragedy or liberation or both.